You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Monster House presents.
Monster Talk is proud to be a part of the Airwave Media family, home of such shows as the Daily Meditation Podcast, The Accidental Creative, and I Know What Scares You. If you'd like to advertise on this show, contact sales at advertisecast.com. Human beings have a strange relationship with swamps. For much of history, cultures have viewed swamps as undesirable or even dangerous wastes of potential farmland. Real estate built on drained swampland exists around the world, and until the latter third of the 20th century, not many tears were shed over the departure of this kind of murky, dank, insect and reptile-filled landscape. In the United States, our national capital was literally built by draining swampland. And it's a fairly recent thing for enough concerned ecologists to try and get us to realize how vital and important these habitats actually are. Their campaign even gets down to language management, as marketing people have striven to get folks to say wetlands preferentially over swamp, because so many people instinctively either fear, hate, or disregard such places without thought. And of course, it didn't stop there. We also populated our swamps with monsters, and we still do. Cryptid author Lyle Blackburn has a whole book dedicated to swamp cryptids called Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries from the Mire. From Boggy Creek's Falk Monster, to the Honey Island Swamp Monster, to the Lizard Man of Scapore Swamp, folks see things in those dark and foreboding waters. The vines, the shadows, the unrecognized animal sounds, the water so black you can't see more than a foot down. Our minds fill those shadows and voids with sinister creatures, crawling death in the form of real animals like snakes and alligators. And where real creatures aren't enough, we make up new things, like humanoid swamp monsters of fiction that began in the 1940s with Theodore Sturgeon's incredible short story, It. It was the inspiration for The Heap, for Swamp Thing, and eventually Man Thing, comic books' answer to a reading public's desperate need for more swamp monsters. But it turns out that it wasn't humanoid plant monsters, or oversized reptiles, or man-eating vines, and not even quicksand that was the real danger in all those swamps. It was something smaller, something folks forever had thought was merely an annoyance. But it was something we couldn't escape, and it wanted to drink our blood. There's hardly a place on Earth where you could truly hide from this monster.
It's actually quite unlike anything we've ever seen before.
A giant, hairy creature, part ape, part man.
In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster.
Monster Talk.
Welcome to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
It's hard to believe just how recently mankind has realized the danger of the mosquito. These little insects are hands down the most dangerous animal known to man. By now, most people know that they're the primary disease vector for malaria. But that's not the only dangerous thing they carry, as we'll hear in this interview. When colonialism was the primary driver of the wealth of the British Empire, one huge problem that they struggled with was that their colonists kept coming down with tropical infections. Malaria in particular was devastating. A remedy for the disease came from the bark of a tree, which had been used by indigenous healers for hundreds of years. While this same remedy was used by the Europeans, it was not well understood and was the subject of intense scientific research. The particular substance in the bark was isolated chemically in 1820 by two French chemists. But there was a tremendous push to find a way to create this substance artificially and to not need to rely on the slow life cycle of a tree in order to treat the many colonists who had no immunity to this terrible disease. That substance we now know as quinine. It is still used in malaria treatment today, but because it is very bitter, it was usually mixed with other liquids, and the British in particular came to mix it with tonic water and gin, and perhaps, a little on the nose for the Brits, a bit of lime juice. So even if you live in an area with no malaria, you've probably encountered quinine. I mention all this because something pretty amazing happened in that drive to find a synthetic malaria treatment. A 19-year-old chemistry student named William Perkin came home on a school holiday and decided to try and synthesize quinine from coal tar. This was a bold and perhaps ridiculous attempt given his youth and inexperience, and as you might expect, the experiment was a complete failure. But when he went to clean up his equipment, he found he'd made a big mess. A big, absurdly purple mess. His failed attempt to make quinine had produced the first synthetic color, and one that was immediately and obviously valuable. Up until this point, purple was primarily created through a very time-consuming and expensive process that involved killing a particular kind of mollusk. With Perkins' new process, a bright, long-lasting dye had been created, and he'd made his fortune. Not only that, but his discovery kicked off the synthetic color industry that would be picked up by German chemists and would literally change the way the world looks. That, in turn, allowed the new science of color microscopy, improving the ability to see detail in microscopic samples by applying dyes, to reach new insights and see amazing new details, which in turn led to an even more amazing discovery when it was found out that these dyes would sometimes kill some nasty microbes and leave other cells undamaged, which kicked off a new science we now call chemotherapy. All of this happens, and people still didn't know what was causing malaria. It wasn't until the very late 1800s, the last couple of decades, that convergent discoveries concluded that there was a parasite at the root of the disease and that the mosquito was what was spreading the parasite. It's been a little more than a century that we've known about how dangerous mosquitoes are. And in that time, a huge number of quack cures, wacky theories, and dubious products have tried to alleviate the mosquito problem. So where do we stand today? How dangerous are these creatures now? Is there anything we can do to protect ourselves? Stick around and find out as we're joined by Dr. Louisa Messenger, who knows quite a bit about the world's most dangerous animal.
Monster Dog.
So my name is Dr. Louisa Messenger. I'm currently an assistant professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. There I'm also the co-director of the Parasitology and Vector Biology Laboratory. But my specialities are I'm a medical entomologist and parasitologist, and I spend most of my time working on improving methods of control and surveillance of insect-borne diseases, both regionally here in the United States as well as worldwide.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. And the reason that I invited you on was that I guess my son and I go for a walk every day. It's summertime here in Denver, and we are just getting eaten alive by mozzies, as we call them in Australia. I was just thinking about mosquitoes in terms of being monstrous because they drink blood and because they bite and they carry diseases like malaria. And so I just looked up mosquito experts, and you kept coming up. And I read the article that the Washington Post had where they spoke with you about this topic. So, yeah, we wanted to bring you on the show. And as a first question, could you tell us some interesting information about the biology of mosquitoes? So maybe what they eat, although we know that to some extent, but there are some surprises there too, I guess, and describe them and some info about their distribution as well.
Absolutely. Well, you're not wrong. Mosquitoes definitely are monsters. One of the things I always ask my students when we first start talking about mosquitoes is what's the most dangerous animal on the planet to humans? And a lot of the times they'll say sharks, lions, bear attacks, or even other humans. But statistically, it's the mosquito. The female mosquito kills them as humans every year. So you're definitely not wrong about them being monstrous. So the word mosquito, I mean, basically mosquitoes are just a family of small flying insects. There's about 3,600 species. But the word mosquito itself, it's Spanish or Portuguese. It just means a little fly. So musca and then ito means little fly. That's why we call them mosquitoes. You're not wrong again about them being especially prevalent in the summer. But I guess the bad news is that mosquitoes occur all over the planet. There's only a very few number of isolated islands and Antarctica where we don't get mosquitoes. We get them down at sea level. You get them at elevations of over 5,000 meters. Mosquitoes are really adaptable for a very broad range of environments. Most of the time we think about them in terms of the tropics and a lot of disease when it's hot and humid, but you also get plenty of mosquitoes in deserts, in the Arctic tundra, salt marshes, different ocean and tidal zones as well. So I guess that's the bad news is there's very few places on the planet that you can go to escape mosquitoes. And in terms of their actual diet, so it's the female, she's the culprit. She's the one who is adapted for blood feeding. And now she takes a blood meal approximately every 3 days. And every 3 days, she's going to digest that blood using the nutrients to grow eggs. And then she's going to lay those eggs. And she's going to do that for about 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the species. The male mosquitoes, their only role is to mate with the female once she emerges as an adult. And then they'll just sugar feed for the rest of their life cycle. The females will also take sugar. This is usually from plants, from flowers, from other vegetation, but she really needs that blood meal regularly to be able to survive and to reproduce the next generation.
Yeah. My 9-year-old son just told me that. I had no idea. I don't know how he found out about that either, but yeah, that was news to me after getting bitten for decades and just not knowing it was the female of the species that did that.
Well, that's interesting. Is the blood meal particularly useful because of like the protein content or something else about it, as opposed to, I didn't actually know they did sugar content. That makes sense. I was literally just telling my kids the other day, almost every life form can enjoy sugar. They need to, but other stuff, not so much.
No, absolutely. It's because to produce eggs, it's very energetically expensive for a female mosquito. I mean, it's the same for reproduction in almost all organisms. It takes quite a lot of nutrients and energy to produce the next generation. And so she will digest the proteins and the components of the blood to produce vitellogenin. It's a type of egg yolk that she then produces her eggs with. She will take sugar, though, because that's important for flight, for dispersal, for mating as well. So she does need other types of energy resources. But that blood's crucial for egg production. Well,
if you don't mind another follow-up, have there been experiments done, like if you provide them with plenty of protein, like a liquid diet, would they still prefer blood, or would they not need it, therefore not seek it?
That's a great question. I don't know, to my knowledge, off the top of my head, but they're so evolutionarily adapted for blood feeding. I would be surprised. I think they're still always going to seek out, at least the female mosquitoes are going to seek out blood as that ultimate sort of nutrient-rich source.
Evolution's hard to fight.
Yeah. And her mouth parts are so well adapted. They're essentially like a hypodermic syringe. The proboscis, her mouth parts, they're just perfect for blood feeding. Again, that just reflects many millennia of evolution. So, like you said, it's hard to fight that.
So they're vectors for lots of diseases. And now, my understanding is that this is actually, all things considered, a relatively new discovery. Maybe like the 1890s, early 1900s. But what diseases do they carry? And I guess I'm curious as like how the world adapted to finding out this is such an important vector for these diseases.
I guess it depends where you are in the world. It will depend exactly what mosquito disease you're most at risk at. In terms of the statistics and in terms of human health, malaria really is the number one killer in terms of mosquito-borne diseases, because it's an acute infection and it can be fatal very quickly. In fact, the very worrying statistic we all throw around a lot is that a child under the age of 5 dies of malaria every minute. So there's more than 600,000 deaths from malaria and 249 million cases worldwide. Now, historically, though, malaria has been a global issue. It's largely concentrated now in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and small pockets in parts of the world like Venezuela, Papua New Guinea, and India. But we used to have malaria here in the United States up until the 1950s. That's the very reason that the CDC exists in Atlanta, was to try to combat and eventually eliminate malaria. But in places that malaria isn't the predominant mosquito-borne disease, we've got plenty of others. So malaria is a type of parasite, but then the ones that we're dealing with globally and also in the United States are arboviruses. So these are viruses that are transmitted by mosquitoes, different species than the ones that transmit malaria. And you'll have heard of these. These are like West Nile, dengue virus. We may remember the Zika virus in 2016, chikungunya, yellow fever. There's plenty of these viral infections, which are quite difficult to diagnose. A lot of them don't necessarily have a vaccine or any good treatment options, but they can be quite severe and sometimes fatal as well.
So you mentioned different species, and in the articles where you were interviewed, you'd also mentioned a new species. So that's a worrying thing. Can you tell us about this new species of mosquito?
So that's only a new species here where we're based in Las Vegas in Nevada. We're basically a desert and historically haven't had as many populations of mosquitoes and species of mosquitoes as we do now. But what I was referring to is Aedes aegypti, which is spread all across the tropics and subtropics. And it's the major vector of dengue, chikungunya, Zika, yellow fever as well. We're concerned about it here because it invaded the Las Vegas area in 2017. Initially, it was just reproducing in maybe 5 or 6 zip codes, but last year it became explosive and it spread all across the valley to more than 46 zip codes. And we're trying to understand exactly what event triggered that. And now, unfortunately, the community are being bitten during the day. It's a day biting mosquito. And a lot of us react quite badly to it as well. You'll get quite nasty welts. It's unpleasant. It's not transmitting any disease here in Vegas that we know about yet. But we have had dengue in nearby Arizona quite recently. So we are concerned that because our mosquito species here are changing and adapting and spreading, that's also then going to change our risk of disease here as well. But dengue, as Aedes aegypti, is a massive culprit worldwide. I don't know if you've been following in the news that there's been more than 5 million cases of dengue in Brazil already. Large parts of Central America and South America, like Peru, are also experiencing really severe outbreaks this year, and that's vectored by Aedes aegypti. So while it's not necessarily causing disease in my back garden yet, we're worried about it, and then the rest of the world is already having to deal with this as an issue.
You really surprise me because when I think about mosquitoes, I always think about them needing standing water. And when I think about Vegas, I don't think about standing water, but it must be there somewhere.
Well, no, that's the problem with Aedes aegypti is it can breed in incredibly small containers. It breeds in artificial containers. It can be as small as the, cap on a bottle of Coca-Cola, for example. She lays her eggs just above the waterline, and then when the water rises, those eggs will then begin to hatch. Those eggs are also desiccation and drought resistant. You can have eggs that have been around for 9+ months, and we do that quite frequently in our laboratory. But that makes it a perfect insect vector to spread all over the world. It needs such a small amount of water, and it can persist over winter or during periods where there isn't necessarily any available standing water. But unfortunately, we do have plenty of artificial water bodies. We kind of bring this on ourselves a little bit in our golf courses here, in some of our more elaborate water features, in our communities, on the Vegas Strip as well. So you're right, we're a desert. We shouldn't really have that much standing water, but we make them ourselves. And then we have also had abnormal rains for the last few years. We've had more rainfall here than we have had historically. So we're definitely seeing the effects of climate change in our kind of macro environment here in southern Nevada.
As much as possible, we like to help people minimize nonsense and, increase their sort of scientific awareness. And I know science is always provisional. Like we're always learning new things. But I can't think of a pest-related field that's as full of nonsense as mosquitoes and how to repel them and folklore around what attracts them and what doesn't. And, there's all these ideas out there about people think they know mosquitoes, and obviously there's many species. So even if some of these are true, they may not be true for everything. But in general, what sort of things attract mosquitoes? And here I'm thinking about human hosts, and what sort of things actually repel them?
So we get asked this question a lot, and I have to debunk quite a lot of sort of hearsay and anecdotes. But in general, female mosquitoes, she's basically after your blood. So what she's going to do is try to locate you as easily and efficiently as possible. And she'll do that using olfactory receptors on her antennae. She's going to use that to try to smell you. She's going to be picking up things like carbon dioxide in our breath, human sweat, lactic acid, skin volatiles, octanol, phenols, and sometimes your body heat. Some people also, if you have very sweaty, smelly, cheesy-like feet, she may also use that to try to locate you. And she's going to do that essentially to try and get a blood meal as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. The best thing that you can possibly do, which is what I always tell everybody, and that's not really what they want to hear, is to try to use some kind of effective repellent, some kind of topical insecticide that you apply to your skin. These ideally should be approved by some regulatory agency, like the US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. But these chemicals, they're not that nice. There'll be chemicals like DEET, picaridin, citronella, IL-3535. You can have some slightly nicer ones like oil of lemon eucalyptus. But people always tell me, I don't want to use chemicals. I don't want to put something noxious or toxic on my skin. What about if I eat some garlic or I, have some cinnamon? And maybe anecdotally, sometimes that can potentially repel mosquitoes or slightly interfere with her ability to find you. But the problem as a scientist is if it's not robust, reproducible data that's really backed up, I can't advocate for you to do that. If you think it may work for you, okay, that's fantastic. But we know that these tried and true insecticides do work. That's why they are approved. And they're really easy to get hold of over the counter. In terms of what can alter, because I also get a lot of people asking me, well, I'm a mosquito magnet, or mosquitoes never touch me, but they touch they'll eat my husband, that kind of thing. There's definitely some evidence that people smell a little bit differently to different mosquitoes, but it's usually just what's happening physiologically with you. So are you particularly sweaty? Are you running a bit hot that day? Maybe you've had a beer. Increased body temperature is an indicator for mosquitoes to kind of find you. The surface microbiome, whatever's on your skin at the moment, that will also influence just how good you smell to insects, particularly mosquitoes. I'll read these articles like wash with this soap and that will prevent any mosquitoes from biting you, or apply this type of coconut smelling cream and that works well as well. But some of those things can work to an extent, but what they're really doing is just changing your microorganisms on your body at particular time. But the problem is that's not consistent. We don't consistently smell the same at the same time every single day. It just depends what we're doing, what we're eating, what the weather's like, what we are wearing on the surface of our skin. So really the best thing you can do, at least for the type of mosquitoes we have here in the US, is really good, robust repellent.
And I find that interesting that you mentioned citronella, because we grew up burning citronella candles, and you have them everywhere outside if you are having a barbecue or whatever. So that's interesting that does work.
Yeah, that's definitely one that can interfere. And people, that's a nice sort of more friendly way to, especially in your community, if everybody's not necessarily wearing long sleeves or able to apply repellent, you can do things like that, which should have a little bit of an impact. The other things you can do, at least in and around your back garden, is make sure your house is appropriately screened. So you've got screens on your doors, screens on your windows, and you keep those shut. That's one of the main reasons why we were able to eliminate malaria in the US as a public health problem, is simply better house construction so mosquitoes can't fly in. The other thing you can do is dump out any standing water that you may have. If your pool isn't chlorinated or if it's not running, if you maybe have a bird bath or a water feature, any small amounts of standing water, like I mentioned, even a small bottle cap, if that's hidden under one of your bushes, then that contains water. Any of those can be potential mosquito breeding sites. So you can't really control what your neighbors necessarily do, but at least in your back garden, you can do some kind of environmental management as well to try and reduce mosquito breeding.
I don't know much about the life cycle of, say, malaria, for example. And you said it's a parasite. So Is it the sort of thing that a mother passes to her children through the process of birth, or is it something they have to be infected with as baby mosquitoes? How does that life cycle work?
So for malaria, there isn't any transmission from the mother mosquito to the eggs. There is for some of the other viruses like dengue virus and West Nile virus that we have here in the US as well as globally. With malaria, it's an interesting life cycle, that one, because the adult mosquito, she will take a blood meal within about 24 hours after she emerges from being a pupa. She needs to feed quite quickly. And if she feeds on somebody who is already infected with malaria, she will acquire that parasite, but it then takes about 2 weeks for her to develop that parasite, first in her midgut in the blood meal. It then migrates back to her salivary glands. It takes 2 weeks for her to become infectious. So she'll be continuing to bite people every 3 days because she needs that blood to make her eggs, but she won't actually be an infectious mosquito for about 10 to 14 days. So that actually means in a community, it's the older mother mosquitoes for malaria that are the ones that are transmitting. So in places where it's very humid or very, very hot and mosquitoes aren't able to actually live for 2 full weeks, maybe they're dying at more of a rapid rate because the environment is really hostile and very harsh, there won't be as much malaria transmission because our mosquitoes are becoming infected, but they are not becoming infectious, if that makes sense to you.
It's a parasite, and we know it has some pretty nasty effects on humans. What does it harm the mosquito substantially?
No, so mosquitoes, again, have really co-evolved with the parasites and the viruses that they can transmit, such that they have really good immunity against that infection. That allows them exactly to be the perfect insect vectors, essentially to be perfect flying syringes containing these different pathogens.
Well, in malaria in particular, so they've just evolved to not be affected by the particular, I guess, the things that bother us. Is that? And I guess I'm wondering, do they have any immunity? Is there anything genetically we could steal from them?
Yeah.
They'll just amount enough of an immune response to tolerate the infection, such that it's not going to necessarily kill the mosquito. Infection may have small fitness costs to the female mosquito. She may lay smaller egg batches potentially, or may not fly around as much. But like I said, again, just those thousands of years of coevolution together have made it such that the infection can establish and she can tolerate it, and then she has to essentially vector that disease onwards into humans.
Amazing. So you've really proven to us, Louisa, that mosquitoes are seen as a nuisance. But is there any way that we can possibly learn to like them a little?
I mean, yeah, unfortunately, with most monstrous insects and other animals, they do play quite vital roles in our ecosystems.
Right.
We get the question a lot, can we just eliminate whole species? And that's a bit of a tricky question to answer. Mosquitoes are great food sources for other insects, especially when they're breeding in the water bodies in the aquatic environment. There'll be plenty of other insects and animals that will predate mosquito larvae, like dragonflies, beetles, amphibians, frogs and toads, small fishes. Birds and bats will also eat adult mosquitoes. They may also be quite substantial food resources for those types of insectivorous animals. So again, we don't necessarily want to eliminate that food resource for them either. There's some data to suggest that mosquitoes may also pollinate flowers and different types of vegetation, especially male mosquitoes, since they'll be sugar feeding predominantly and exclusively. Now, when we think of pollinators, we're usually thinking of bees, those kinds of insects, but mosquitoes may also play a role in that. They're also a really good indicator of biodiversity and environmental changes as well. Those are just my sort of in support of why we shouldn't necessarily be wanting to eliminate mosquitoes entirely. But what we medical entomologists and public health professionals want to do is eliminate the diseases that they potentially transmit, or at least try to interrupt and safeguard human health from that point of view.
Right. So they have their place.
They have their place, but we don't want that place to be in essentially the global burden of human disease.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I've heard lots of defense against eliminating species of insects for, just as you're saying, they have, they're little, they harm us, but they're also great pile of calories for other life forms. So, and we all need our calories. But I'm just wondering a little bit about the way that you study the populations of these insects. So I'm guessing there's traps involved, but I wonder, are you using things like eDNA at all? I'm just fascinated by the ways you can sort of test an environment to see what's out there.
Yeah, so we use plenty of different types of surveillance techniques. It usually depends on what your research question is or what you're interested essentially in investigating. The kind of gold standard way to collect mosquitoes, both here regionally as well as internationally, is using exactly that, different types of traps. And these traps will target different parts of we call it the gonotrophic life cycle. So essentially what that female or the male mosquitoes are up to. One of the gold standard types of traps comes from the CDC. It's a light trap. Essentially, it's a UV light that the mosquitoes are attracted to, and then a fan that essentially stops them. Once they fly into the trap, they can't escape back out. And we'll hang that at the base of a bed that somebody's sleeping under, potentially indoors, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa. That person will be sleeping under a bed net. They've got a light trap hanging at the foot of their bed. Mosquitoes are hungry. She's trying to take a blood meal because she's starving and she needs that nutrients. And she will get potentially diverted into that trap, attracted by the light and then the smell that are emanating from the individual. Here in the US, we may use gravid traps. We may use traps that smell like an aquatic body that a mosquito may want to come and lay her eggs in. So she'll come in to try and lay her eggs in an artificial trap and again become unable to escape. But in places where we suspect we may have invasive species, so species that may not necessarily be targeted by some of these traps, most of the time these traps are optimized for different genre of mosquitoes, so maybe Anopheles, Culex, or Aedes, or maybe even different types of species. But we can use environmental DNA. It's essentially like forensic science. It's sampling DNA from the soil, from the water, and then extracting any nucleic acid and using different molecular assays to try and detect new species of interest. We've been trying to pilot that here in Las Vegas, especially in relation to Aedes aegypti, which I told you has invaded quite recently. But there's also an invasive vector species in Africa called Anopheles stevensii that's invaded from India. And it's an urban vector, which the malaria vectors in Africa haven't historically been urban. They've been predominantly rural. And we're trying to use the same techniques to survey cities, areas where people aren't usually at risk of that transmission. So they're at risk of quite severe disease. But again, we like the concept of doing that kind of environmental DNA sampling because you don't need to be a trained entomologist. I don't need to train you how to collect a 50 ml water sample. I can just give you a tube and ask you to please bring me a sample from your back garden. I don't need to teach you how to set a trap or how to identify particular species of not just mosquitoes, but any other flying insects. So we think it's got real potential for citizen science and community type surveillance, which also then has the collateral benefit of raising mosquito awareness. Like I said here, the rhetoric I get is that we've never really had mosquitoes. Why am I suddenly getting bitten this year? What can I do? We want the community to be asking those kind of thoughtful questions. And if we can get them engaged in sampling, engaged in what's happening in their own back gardens or communities, then we can kind of tackle these diseases together, us as the academics, and then also with the members of the community who are the most affected.
Fantastic. Yeah, this is all so interesting. And I've just got a little side question before we start to wrap things up. I'm pretty sure that sometimes I think I'm hearing mosquitoes. So maybe at night when the lights are out and I'm hearing a little buzzing sound. And I don't think we've covered this yet, but do mosquitoes actually buzz? Is there any way, aside from feeling them on you, to tell that they're around?
They absolutely do buzz. And there are some other flying insects that are also going to make, a similar sound, but in all likelihood, if it's near your ear, it probably is a mosquito that's trying to find a blood meal. So what happens is the mosquito, so she's beating her wings at a particular frequency, and The way they mate is the males will swarm, usually around lights in the kind of early dusk and early evening. And then a female will fly into the male swarm, and the males will recognize that she's a viable female of the same species as them by the sounds of her wing beat frequency. So different species of mosquitoes will beat their wings at different frequencies. So then the males will know, okay, that's the same species as me, let's go mate, or no, it's not, let's ignore that and wait for another potential mate to fly into our swarm. And there's been some other academic groups that have been interested in developing apps for your phone where you can take a sound recording and then your mobile phone can potentially tell you, yeah, that was Aedes aegypti, or no, that was Culex quinquefasciatus that flew by. Again, using our quite advanced mobile phone technology that we have and our ability to record sound on our phones. So we're not working on that, but there are groups out there that are trying to do exactly that, to understand how the mosquitoes sound to us and to one another.
So it's like Shazam, but it can let you know if somebody's walking like an Egypti. Yep.
Pretty much.
I should have warned you about his puns. But Louisa, your work is really interesting. Can you tell us a bit about what you're working on at the moment?
Absolutely. So, like I said, we try and mainly spend our time working on more creative ways to kill mosquitoes, or at least to stop them from interacting with humans. That's what I always tell my students. I'm basically just really good at killing bugs. That's my whole career. At the moment, we have a really unprecedented amount of West Nile here in the Las Vegas area, which has never happened here before. So we are quite concerned about the risk for increased human transmission. So we've got several projects in our laboratory at the moment. We do a lot of whole genome sequencing to try and understand the genetics of the mosquito and then the genetics of the pathogen that they transmit. So we can track where are these coming from, where are mosquitoes moving around, how are they moving around, are there any environmental or ecological risk factors? And with things like West Nile, is it invading every year from, say, Arizona that does have quite a significant problem nearby? Or do we have endemic populations of the virus here in Las Vegas? As soon as we can kind of get a better handle on how things are spreading and how if we can predict where they're going to spread, that then offers opportunities for control and targeted control measures. So that's some of the work that we're doing here in Vegas, as well as also testing our populations for resistance to insecticides, because we may want to start doing some chemical control. We are doing some of that environmental DNA monitoring, trying to test these tools out and engage our citizens in some science activities. But we also have some projects over in sub-Saharan Africa, because as I said, malaria is such a significant problem there. And we're currently supposed to be eliminating malaria by the year 2030, and we're 89% off track in terms of the technical strategic goals set by the World Health Organization. And one of the main problems that we have is that our mosquitoes, at least in Africa, are very intensely resistant to the chemicals that we can use in bed nets and for public health there. So we participate in lots of clinical trials that are testing new types of bed nets, new different insecticides, different modalities for deploying these chemicals in communities. Because, as I said, malaria, in the last sort of 31 minutes since we've started talking, 31 individuals will have died from malaria. It's such an egregious public health problem. And so we spend a lot of our time also trying to support research activities out there too.
I thank you for doing this work, because it's
very important work.
It is so important, and it affects everybody. I mean, I remember as a kid learning that they have mosquitoes in Alaska and thinking, oh no, it's like, how can they have them up there? But I guess it gets hotter in Alaska.
Can't go there either. Yeah.
Yeah, they are little nightmares. But thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this today.
Yes,
thank you for the important work you're doing. If people want to learn more about these programs, is there a particular website or location you'd like to refer people to?
I can give you our lab website. Maybe you can include it in the podcast information. And then anyone who's we really need anyone who's interested in this kind of area. You don't need to love bugs. You don't even need to touch or handle insects, which a lot of my students don't want to go anywhere near them. But we need everybody to fight against vector-borne diseases. Maybe you want to look at it from the disease surveillance point of view, or maybe clinical diagnostics. Maybe you want to work in the communities, understanding the populations. There are so many different roles and important data that we need to be collecting to essentially work towards the control and elimination of these diseases. You don't need to just play with insects all day long like I do, but there's a role for anyone who's potentially interested in this kind of field. So please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to anybody who's interested.
Fantastic. We will definitely check the show notes. There will be links there for all of that. Now, I believe Karen warned you that we like to finish up our first interviews with folks with a signature question. And this could be whatever you want it to be. But what is your favorite monster?
So as a medical entomologist, I feel like I would be really remiss if my favorite monster wasn't the legend of the Mothman. Ooh, you know, the American folklore?
Yeah.
Yes.
Nice.
I mean, come on, it's a moth, right?
Perfect.
So I grew up in the UK, and I had never heard about this. I mean, you can tell that probably from my accent. But I'd never heard about this until quite recently when I was listening to, I think, another podcast, more of like a murder, true crime type podcast. And they told the story, the legend of the Mothman from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And it was a comedy. It was very funny the way they presented this. But I think what amused me the most was this large sort of black 7-foot-tall creature with glowing red eyes that would just scream at cars first thing in the morning. And it just reminded me of what I think I probably look like in the morning before I've had my coffee. And I just enjoyed that kind of mystery of it being a harbinger of doom and a warning omen as this gigantic insect. So I think for me, that's probably my favorite monster.
Very suitable.
It is. I like hearing that too, because, you know, we tend to go really deep on all of this stuff, you know, learning about the historical context, but these stories evolve over time. And so, you know, as someone who comes into this material fresh, I love hearing how it's coming to you. Like, are you getting it through podcasts or movies or, you know, radio or whatever, and how it varies over time. It's just fascinating to me, because I think these stories sort of evolve in the same way species evolve. You just never know what's going to come out the other end. It's fascinating. So.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time, Louisa. This is just all fascinating, and it just a lot of things that I haven't known and haven't thought about either.
Yeah, raising awareness. So I
was going to say, thank you so much for the invitation, guys. This has been great. I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad I found you.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, and good luck out there in Vegas. That's a gambling joke.
Yeah,
okay.
Definitely keep cool. Keep cool.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Monster Talk.
You've been listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
You just heard an interview with mosquito expert Dr. Louisa Messenger discussing the dangers of mosquito-borne diseases and the myths and facts of mosquito management. Check our show notes for links to her research and the photos that she kindly provided us. Around the world, people report monsters, but are they real? Join the detective of the impossible, Joe Nickel, as he walks you through investigations to reveal often surprising natural explanations behind some of the most famous cryptids and legendary animals ever reported. Using scientific skepticism, meticulous fieldwork, and historical deep dives, Joe Nickel seeks out hidden clues and real-world candidates that sometimes reveal that even the most unlikely monster stories may have a basis in reality. The Science of Monsters is the first book from Monster House LLC, the publisher of science shows Monster Talk and In Research Of. The revised edition is now on sale and includes corrections and suggestions from you, our listeners, and now readers. Sales of The Science of Monsters directly benefits Monster House and its podcasts, thanks to the generosity of its author. Pick up the revised Science of Monsters today at Amazon.com, available in paperback and Kindle editions. Monster Talk theme music is by Pete Stealing Monkeys. Stay cool, stay safe, and watch out for those six-legged vampires.
This has been a Monster House presentation.